Hey, what's up artists, art fans, and art enthusiasts? My name is Eben, and welcome to this week's video. Now today I wanted to go over something I see a lot with students in my mentorship program, and I get a lot of requests to do content around this, so today we're going to dive into perspective and how you can use it in your painting or your drawing or whatever medium you're using to create convincing three-dimensional space. Now, perspective is really important no matter what you're depicting because it's really the language of how the eye perceives 3D space. And there are a lot of tips and different sort of shortcuts you can use to make convincing perspective even without drawing out a whole perspective grid like you may have tried before. So real quickly before we dive in, I just want to remind you guys to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that bell so you don't miss new videos I release every Wednesday, as well as live streams that I do on Sundays. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, so now we're in Photoshop here, and the first thing you have to understand about perspective is, you really have to think about it in terms of 3 dimensions. Of course, we're working within 3-dimensional space. That is the space that we occupy. We have to think about 3 dimensions. So for the purposes of today's video, let's just map these dimensions out and give them some names. Now, you might have seen something like this if you've ever worked with 3D programs or anything like that. You'll see something like this. You'll probably see, let's call this our Z-axis, and then in green here, or turquoise, let's call this our X-axis, and then in this other color here, blue that is, let's call this our Y-axis. So these are the 3 axes that define 3-dimensional space. Now, when we're mapping out perspective, we want to think about all 3 of these axes depending upon whether you are using 1-point, 2-point, or 3-point perspective. Now, what's important to understand before we dive into that is you may have heard these terms before, 1-point, 2-point, etc. Now, these are 3 different ways to describe 3-dimensional space, but the first 2 are really just shortcuts. In fact, the only way to accurately describe 3D space is with 3 points of perspective, aka 3-dimensional axes. Now, the reason 1- and 2-point perspective are used sometimes is because you're not always going to clearly see the effect of the other 2 vanishing points that we will explore later. Now, I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second here. So let's just take a cube, for example, and let's map out our x-axis here, and then our, let's use orange for our z-axis, and green again for our x-axis. Now we can imagine, if you've ever done any kind of geometry, this is the symbol for sort of a right angle. So with a cube, all of these are at right angles to one another. So a cube is going to be fairly easy to map out with perspective because both the top and the bottom angles are operating parallel to one another. So we can show both the top and the bottom dimensions of the cube with those same axis lines. We can use our Z to define this vertical one as well. Now, the way it's set up right now is actually not necessarily super accurate when it comes to depicting a 3D cube, and I'll show you why. So imagine you're looking down on yourself from far above. Let's put you right here. That's the top of your head. Now, if we're thinking about our axes again, let's say X is straight ahead. That's going to bring us right to our horizon line. So if you're sitting here at your desk or wherever you are, just imagine straight ahead, that's our X-axis. Now, our Y-axis is going to come off at a right angle. Now, if you're looking straight ahead, you're probably not going to see it. It's going to be somewhere off, coming right out of your right ear. And then, of course, our Z-axis, we're not going to be able to see because it's going straight up and down. It's actually just this one little spot right here. It's going right towards us from the camera. Now, let's imagine we're looking at yourself from the side. Let's call that a person. Now, this was our x-axis, and this is our y-axis. In this case, we're looking forward, so our x-axis is going this way. Now, our y-axis, we actually can't really see it because it's coming straight at us. Meanwhile, our z-axis is going straight up. So these are just some important things to consider when you are visualizing the space in front of you. Now, let's use our canvas and imagine it's kind of like a camera lens. So here's the frame of our lens. Now, if we're looking forward, let's say we're looking out over a big field. And let's say this field is completely flat. Now what we'll see is what we call the horizon line. Now the horizon line is simply where the sky meets the ground plane. Now the horizon line also describes any object of the same height as the viewer at any distance. So if I'm standing here and I'm looking out at another version of myself standing out here, they're going to kind of look slightly above that horizon line. But the further they get away from me, the closer they're going to get to that line. So that's why we call that the horizon line. Now let's go back to our x-axis. So if we're standing right here and we're looking out, our x-axis is going to go straight forward from where we are and head towards the horizon line. Now our y-axis is going to go somewhere off to the side, and our z-axis is also going to go straight up, and we're not going to see either of those on our canvas. Now that's important because this is where one-point perspective comes into play. When people talk about using one-point perspective, what they're saying is basically all that matters in this image is the x-axis, so that's all I'm going to use to plot out my perspective. So let's go over that real quickly. So say we're standing right here and we're looking out at our horizon line. Our x-axis is going out straight in that direction. We can describe what we're going to call a vanishing point. Now a vanishing point is just a spot on the horizon line where our x-axis will meet that line. It basically describes a distant point that is the same height as where we are relative to the ground. So now, if we envision there are other objects that are facing the same direction that are aligned with this viewpoint, we can imagine them following that perspective line to the vanishing point. So let's say there's a giant cube right here, and two of the lines are heading in that direction towards the vanishing point. We can describe the plane of that cube by showing lines that head in that direction. And then we can form the other end of this cube with another vertical line. And then we can see it starts to look like a three-dimensional box. Likewise, if we have one over here, maybe it's a little bit smaller and it's lower to the ground, there's the vertical side, and then these other sides will also be pointing towards that vanishing point. Now what you see is when this happens, even though these two blue sides are technically the same height, one is perceived as being shorter than the other. And that's because when objects move or recede into the distance, they appear smaller, right? If you throw a ball, it gets smaller as it goes away. These are just basic properties of three-dimensional space. That's why you can use the one-point perspective method to create objects that look somewhat three-dimensional. Now, here's the problem with one-point perspective. It doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, these other lines that we've created here are actually describing the other two vanishing points. Problem is, they're so far outside of the canvas, we can't actually see them. This is why some people will use perspective grids to sort of mimic the effect of a vanishing point somewhere far off on the canvas. However, I'm here to tell you don't actually have to use those grids if you think about it carefully. So let's take that same situation once again. We have a horizon line here. This time let's put our x-axis somewhere way over on the side. Now let's create a cube that's right in the center of the canvas. So we already know that to create two of those sides, we're going to have them pointing towards this x-axis. Now if we imagine that there's another axis, the z-axis, that's way up above this canvas here, we can imagine a couple lines converging in that direction. Now the important thing to consider here is that this top width of the x-axis lines is always going to be slightly shorter than the bottom width. In other words, these two lines are not going to be completely parallel. Here's what I mean. Here are two parallel lines. Now that's not going to accurately describe what we're going to see with these two lines converging towards the z-axis vanishing point. we're really going to see something a little bit more like this. So with that in mind, let's plot out the vertical axes of this cube. So I've sort of shortened the distance towards the top. This one in the middle is going basically straight up and down, but if we compare a straight line to this one on the side, there's actually a slight incline there. Now, we could exaggerate this more or less, and I'll get to that later, but for now, it's just best to note that the top side here is going to be shorter than the bottom one here, and these two lines are going to converge towards the top. So way above here, we can imagine somewhere far off on the edge of the canvas, we have our Z vanishing point. And of course, right over here, we have our X vanishing point as well. Now we just have one more to plot out, and that is the Y vanishing point. Now I've situated this cube in such a way that it looks as though we're going to see more of one face of this cube than the other. So if we imagine our Y vanishing point somewhere off to the right side of the canvas, remember it's at a right angle to the X, so if we're looking down at ourselves, it's going to be somewhere way off on the side of the canvas. We can think about it in the same way that we have with the Z-axis, only now these lines are converging on the right side versus the top of the canvas. So it's not going to be completely parallel with the sides of the frame, they're going to converge slightly towards one side. See how that's not completely parallel with the top or the bottom of the frame. Now, down here, it's converging up, and up here it's converging down. Now, once again, we can define our vertical side using our Z-axis, and actually, if we imagine this point way above, we're going to have that line come out even more. That angle is going to be exaggerated even more than it was before. And once again, we can imagine that these lines are continuing to some point way off to the side of the page. Okay, so if that seemed really complicated to you, don't worry, we're going to do a quick example here before we move on to how to use perspective in more organic forms such as landscapes and that kind of thing. So let's do a more realistic example. Say this is our horizon line, but we actually have a few little mountains here. Now, let's say we want to create a cabin that's sort of, right next to us, but sort of receding out into the distance a little bit. Let's put our X vanishing point right there, and let's plot out the sides of this cabin. Okay, so we can think about them as arrows kind of pointing in that direction. Now we don't have to be super exact with this, although of course if you want to draw out the whole line, you're welcome to do that. By the way, the brush I'm using for this is called the Builder brush. I include it in my brush pack. It's just a brush with no transparency, so if you're working in Photoshop, you can use the shift-click function to create some really straight lines. I find that really useful when I am trying to plot out perspective with my shapes. So once again, let's think about our Z-axis way up here somewhere. Now it's going to be at a right angle to the X, and so we can imagine it converging slightly as it goes up like that. And then once again, we can think about our Y-axis somewhere off to the side. Now again, I don't want these lines to be completely parallel with the canvas. I want them to be converging slightly to one side. Now, if we want to create a roof, we can just create another line going from our vanishing point. And then we can create some connector lines. Let's use a different color here, that are going at 45-degree angles out from there. And then we can erase away any inaccuracies there. So now we can see it's starting to look like a three-dimensional object. Now, of course, if we want to embellish this more, we can create doors and windows and everything, but whenever we do, we want to imagine them following these lines up to the vanishing point. So this is it's very subtle, But basically, you want to make sure that if you're making a window, the distance up here is going to be a little bit shorter than the distance down here. Now, this is something you can sort of get used to as you practice it, as you try to apply this. But if you want to use a perspective grid, of course, you can always do that. You can download those and use them in Photoshop to help guide situations like this. Personally, I believe it's very valuable to get a good sense for it and to understand how these spaces are going to be formed between these objects. So once again, I'm going to use that X vanishing point here. I'm going to try to have that distance a little bit more. This distance here is just going to be slightly larger than this distance here. In fact, let's exaggerate that just a little bit more. And then of course on the bottom it's going to be the same thing. And then if we wanted to create a window on this side, we would think about it in the same way. Now notice that as the z-axis lines get further towards the edge of the canvas, they're going to tilt in even more. Now let's say we wanted to create a porch here. We can plot that out using our y-axis lines once again. And then we can use our x-axis line to define the other end of that porch there. So you see, eventually you'll get a space that looks quite realistic and three-dimensional. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that there's not just one vanishing point on the horizon that we want to think about. These are just sort of tools we can use to think about three-dimensional space, but we can put that vanishing point there, or we can put it over here. What these two things are defining is the direction of the object that we're drawing. So this vanishing point over here is defining an object that is facing in that direction, while this vanishing point over on the right is defining an object that's going in that direction. Now in one image you may have two objects or many more objects that are facing in multiple directions, and they will each need their own set of vanishing points to define them. And of course, the main thing to take away here is there are actually an infinite number of points that you can use along your horizon line, as well as an infinite number of points you can use for your Z and your Y axes off canvas. I know it can be very overwhelming, but this is a very important thing to understand about three-dimensional space. I think one mistake I made very often earlier on when I was drawing a lot is I would always imagine there was just one vanishing point defining all of my objects. Now this does apply if you're in a city or something where all of the buildings and everything are blocked out to grids. They're all going to be facing the same direction, and hence they're all going to be following one X vanishing point. However, as we'll see in a minute, in something like a landscape or a road or something that gets a little bit more complex, there can be multiple vanishing points in play. Now, let me just dive in real quickly to talk about what I mean there. So here's our horizon line once again, and let's draw out a road, for example. And let's say this is a winding kind of S-shaped road. And of course, that kind of road is not going to travel in a single linear path towards a distant vanishing point. It's actually going to turn back and forth. So what we can do is actually create a few different vanishing points along our horizon, a few different x-axes to define the different turns and bends of this road. So let's start with one. Let's say the road starts over here and it heads in that direction. And it's very wide because it's pretty close to where we are. Now, as you can see, both of those lines are heading towards that one vanishing point. Now, all of a sudden, the road actually changes direction and it goes a little bit to the left. So let's create a new vanishing point to define that change. Let's just say it goes a little bit in that direction, and then over here, it does the same. And then it takes another twist and actually heads way off to the right. Let's just say for this example, we'll use that color, and we'll have it going off in that direction. And then, one more time, takes a sudden turn, and goes off to the left. Now what we see is a very interesting particular shape, and it's a very important shape to understand whenever you're plotting anything out in a landscape or a wide open space, or even an interior space where there are multiple twists and turns, where there are objects facing multiple different directions. Here's one important thing to understand. As this single object recedes into the distance, you can see that these shapes actually get flatter and flatter, and they get compressed as they get closer to the horizon line. This actually ties back to what I was saying earlier about how if we take the same person of the same height and we put them further and further away, they're going to get smaller and smaller as they get closer to that horizon line. Likewise, these shapes, these changes in shapes as this road recedes into the distance, are going to get flatter as they approach that horizon line. Now let's take another look at the shape of that road as well. So I'm going to go ahead and go over it with this new color so we can get an idea for what this shape looks like overall. Now let's bring our horizon line back in here. Notice how that looks pretty three-dimensional, but it's not quite realistic yet because it's made up of a bunch of really solid lines. Now if we go in here and sort of introduce some nuances, kind of create some more curves here, now it looks a bit more like something we would find in a landscape. Now let's say over to the side here, there's a lake that follows this road really closely. We can actually start to think about how that lake is going to form in terms of its shape based on the way that road behaves. Of course, as these shapes approach the horizon line, they're going to flatten out, and as they get closer to us, they're going to widen, and they're going to form stronger lines leading away from the center of the canvas. Likewise, if we want to create a fluffy cloud somewhere up here, and this cloud is for some reason a really long, uninterrupted cloud, it's going to be very kind of wide up here, and then as it approaches the horizon line, it's going to flatten out a little bit, and then down here we might even see some longer kind of flattened ones where we can see them from a very distant perspective. And then finally, let's imagine maybe there are some hills kind of coming out here, and they can follow the same sort of pattern, and of course they're going to flatten out a little bit as they reach the horizon, and they're going to get smaller. Now it looks a little bit rough right now, but we can actually start to see the formations of a landscape happening here if we follow these very basic sort of intuitive rules about perspective. Now this is why I say you don't always have to plot this stuff out on a grid, and especially if you're using these perspective guidelines for creating landscapes and more organic shapes, you can use what I like to call perspective shapes, which is essentially the kind of shape patterns you see when an object recedes into the distance, kind of like this road or this lake. Now this is what's really important to understand about perspective if you are creating your own landscapes, or even if you are just creating a cityscape or something with a little bit less structure to it, is just that these objects are going to flatten out as they recede towards the horizon, and they're going to form these kinds of shapes. Now I encourage you to go out and find some landscape photo references and look for these shapes within them, try to copy them, and try to articulate those shapes as they move throughout the three-dimensional space of that photograph. You may find that they do tend to resemble this kind of zigzag lightning bolt kind of pattern, especially if you're looking at an uninterrupted continuous shape like a road or a river. So here's an example of a painting I created using some of those perspective shapes. Now if we go over this, we can see a similar type of shape being used, but this is an example of a more long, slow curve here. With this road, we can see it's very wide towards where we are in the canvas, and then it tapers and becomes more flat as it approaches the horizon. Likewise, we can see a similar pattern in this river, and in fact it even zigs back a little bit over here. We can see the same pattern with these hills going towards the horizon, and even within these clouds we can see them getting very wide over here and then tapering down and flattening out as they approach the horizon. Now we can also see on these rock structures at the top here that we are looking from underneath, so we can see the bottom plane and less of the top plane, whereas further down we see more of the top plane and a little bit less of the bottom plane, as is the case with some of these distant shapes that we can't really see very well here. That's another thing to consider when you're plotting out your perspective, is that the higher up things get, the more you're going to see of that bottom plane and the less you're going to see of the tops and sides of that object. Now, these are things we can get into a little bit more later, and I'd be happy to create another video about perspective where I go in and talk about looking at different objects from different perspectives, using things like modifying field of view to create an even more exaggerated perspective in your image, and how that actually matches up to what we've talked about in terms of the X, Y, and the Z axis. There's a lot to cover here in terms of perspective, but if you would like to see more, please leave a comment below and let me know if you have any requests. And of course, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss videos I release every week, as well as the live streams on Sunday. If you want to check out this brush pack too, or any information about the mentorship program where I do one-on-one work with students, you can check out those links in the description below. Alright everyone, hope you have a great week, and I'll catch you next time. Happy painting.